Hello, and today I'm delighted to welcome Ajita Kadiragamar, who worked at Rupavahini, Sri Lanka's first national TV network, almost from its inception in 1982 to about 2002, a period that exceeded 20 years, allowing for subsequent consultancy roles. The site of Rupavahini was close to the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation, SLBC, widely known as Radio Ceylon in Colombo 7, as it is still largely called. The Sri Lanka Rupavahini Corporation, SLRC, was built on land opposite SLBC. Sri Lanka media expanded from radio to TV about 30 years after television had been a thing in the West. Today, we will be discussing Ajita's mammoth history of the first days of television in Sri Lanka about 40 years later, entitled The First 20 Years, How Rupavahini's Founding Generation Shaped Television in Sri Lanka, published by M.D. Gunasena, with about 700 pages, issued in 2024. This is also an opportunity to mention and remember Ajita's father, Lakshman Kadirgamar, who was a distinguished statesman and politician in the island, assassinated by terrorists 20 years ago, around 2005. A fine servant to the nation, murdered in his prime. Ajita, welcome. You've also written about your father, the cake that was baked at home.
Yes, hello, Rajit. And first of all, thank you so much for reaching out. I know a lot of books come your way, so I am ever so pleased that this one caught your attention. Okay, let's start with my father's book. Yes, particularly because this year is his 20th death anniversary. So I wrote the book called The Cake That Was Baked at Home in 2015 on the occasion of his 10th death anniversary. It's a largish book, 560 pages. And the reason partly was that I returned from 10 years in the US in 2013, where I'd been pretty much cut off from everything that was going on here. But I found that people were still so interested in him and his life. I mean, just people would stop me on the streets, literally, or when I walked into a store, anyone knew who I was, and ask about him. And so it made me realize that people still did want to know about the man, not the politician necessarily, but the man. And it made me think, well, his 10th death anniversary is coming up. Maybe I should write the book. And I did. And it was a huge success. In fact, it was reprinted 4 times over the years, but it's been out of print now for quite a few years. So I thought, this being his 20th death anniversary this year, rather than invest in having some sort of event which just comes and goes, I would do something more tangible and reprint the book. I had to look for sponsorship. It's an extremely expensive business now, printing books in Sri Lanka. So I've secured that, and I'm just doing a final run. And then hopefully, is it 300 or 500 more copies will come up, because people still reach out to me in surprising ways. Where can we buy the book? And so I realized this would be a fit tribute to enable more people to learn about his life. So if that satisfies your question about that book, and frankly, after having done it, there too, I spent about a year on research. And you always think a year is long enough, but it never really is. And that was an exhausting venture. So I thought, never again. But here we go. Several years later, I decided. So the background to this book about Rupavahini. In 2021, and if you remember, that was a pretty awful time, right? COVID, and then we here had the economic recession. But I knew in my mind that 2022 was coming up, and that would be the 40th anniversary of Rupavahini. So that seemed a good occasion to, write something. And I believed at the time, I still do, that no one had ever really ventured to write a history in English. I know many people have written in Sinhala, and many of those are personal stories, but I don't think anyone has attempted a comprehensive, sort of all-inclusive history. So there again, in 2021, I thought, okay, I'll give myself a year to to do this. And as I said, COVID was underway. I was here at my estate, fairly secluded, and that was the great. When you want to write a book, the best thing is to be in a secluded place with no distractions. So I reached out initially through every means I could. Email, Facebook. I sort of stalked people on Facebook and LinkedIn to find out who was still around, their contacts, and I reached out to as many of the original gang or the original staff from 40 years ago. And I must say the response, I didn't know what to expect, but the response was tremendous. Everyone thought it was a great idea. And a lot of people said they felt that I was the best to do it because, as a writer, I could invest the time and the effort. And so from emails and a few phone calls, WhatsApps, this is how it got going. I created a spreadsheet. And from there onwards, there was no stopping. It just grew and grew and grew. I have to say, a lot of the original staff now live abroad. The technical people in particular all left. So they're in Canada, the US, Australia, of course, some in the UK, some in other countries. They all responded. And I received anything from, when I made it clear what I wanted was their actual stories and experiences, I received anything from 20 pages per person to maybe just a paragraph or two. But I took it all. I welcomed every single bit of information, and I knew because I knew it would be of use. And I really don't think I left out anything of what was sent to me, which made it hard because this is another big book. This is bordering on 620 pages. And the question always is, where do you stop? When is enough enough? But I felt there were stories to tell. The other thing, my compulsion, writing this book was we were the pioneers. Most of us were in our 20s when we started. Some were older because they came from SLBC, and I'll tell you about that later. But we're all getting on in life now. People are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I knew even that when I started that a lot of people had passed away, a lot of the great talent, and during the course of the writing, so many more people passed away. Some from old age, some from sickness. And it was very, very sad. So I knew I had to get their stories. And in many cases, I just managed to get their stories. And then literally within months, they passed away. So I can't tell you enough how happy I was that I managed to preserve those memories, because when one goes, one goes. And if you haven't preserved your memories or someone have preserved them for you, that little bit of history is lost. So so that went. The writing of it went well. It was a task, but the problem then was that by 2022 February, which was the anniversary date, I was unable by that time to secure funding because, as I told you, it's very expensive here. I did crowdfund a little bit, and that worked well. I managed to raise about 5 lakhs, but still, that was barely half of the cost of the full printing and publishing. So in 2022, if you remember, things were pretty bad. There was economic crisis, prices were rising. Paper itself was rising in costs, the whole printing process. Plus, I had no funding. But like I said, because people were literally dropping like flies, sorry if that sounds crude, I thought I have to do this. And so I dipped into my own savings. And finally, in May 2024, last year, that's 2 years after the intended date, I managed to get the book out. And now, a year later, this month, February 15th, will be the 43rd anniversary. So in a way, talking to you about the book is very timely, Rajat, because next week is 43 years. And I'd like to mention at this point, before we move on and I get sidetracked, one of the greatest rewards is that last month, I got an email from the US Embassy here saying that the US Library of Congress had requested a copy for their archives. And I didn't do this for the money or the fame or the fortune, but that to me meant a lot because it meant that it was accepted as a piece of history, as archive material, which could be preserved in the US Library of Congress of all places. And that in a little way, I helped to put Sri Lanka on the map, or put the early years of our TV industry on the map. So briefly, that's kind of the background. I don't know if you want me to keep talking. Do stop me, right?
Well,
if I carry on too long.
Well, I just like to take a pause, and so this sounds
Yes.
like a technical and historical tribute to your life and the communication industry in Sri Lanka. And you've already covered that it took roughly about, shall we say, 600 pages in 5 years, something like that.
No, Rajat. No, the actual writing was research and writing was a year.
Mm.
In 2021, I took the whole of 2021 to write it in order to try and publish it in 2022, which I couldn't meet the publication date. But the book was already done within that year. It was a massive effort, but yeah, it was done within a year. Though I would say in retrospect, a year is not enough. And if ever I do, I mean, never say never, undertake another project, I would give myself more time because it is very strenuous.
As a member of the Global South, Sri Lanka probably had television rather late in the day, but it certainly wasn't a latecomer. Officially, terrestrial TV came to India in 1982 as well, and the president of Sri Lanka probably decided to embrace this just after as a popular move. What would you like to talk about the dates and how you entered the picture, as it were?
Yeah, so Roger, the interesting thing is, well, SLRC Rupavahini was a gift from the Japanese, as we all know. And it was a gift in gratitude for President J.R. Jayawardena having supported the Japanese, at the Treaty of after the war, at the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. And I just want to read out that, I mean, in his speech, which had a huge impact, he basically said, and this is what caught the attention of the Japanese, was that, I'm quoting the Buddha, he said, hatred ceases not by hatred, but by love. So basically, his stand was that we should not punish or persecute the Japanese, but instead, um, treat them with love and compassion. And obviously, what he said back then in 1951 struck a chord because, decades later, this was the gift that they offered when President J.R. Jayawardena was in power. So actually, feasibility studies for what became Rupavahini began back in 1978. So JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, started surveying, planning, researching back in 78. And JR made it clear from the beginning that we wanted color. We wanted to skip the black and white and go straight into color TV. And the other thing that he stressed also, but because they initially offered TV just for Colombo, and he put his foot down and said, no, color TV for the whole island. Now, the interesting thing is, so while all this was going on, TV actually began in Sri Lanka with ITN, if we recall, in 1979. So ITN was a private venture, which took off in 1979. And but the problem was that there were technical and transmission issues, quite early on, and therefore it was taken over by the government, and it was run by SLBC's technical experts initially. They were called in to run the station because they had, I mean, even though they were radio people, they had far more knowledge and expertise than anyone else would have at the time. So sometimes we forget that actually ITN beat us to it. The ITN operation was very basic, and then it was pretty much for Colombo only. But so in 79, ITN starts, but meanwhile, from 78, all the background work is going on for the commencement of Rupavahini. So Rupavahini was formally launched on February 15th, 1982. So next week, what are we today? Next week makes it 43 years. I was living in Switzerland, living there, studying there. Early in 82, I was getting rather bored with my studies. Anyway, a Sri Lankan friend said, oh, do you know that TV has started in Sri Lanka? And I wasn't too sure. He said, but my neighbor, Mr. Upi, he's a journalist who works at local Swiss TV. Would you like to meet him? And so I said yes and went over for dinner. And when he started, when he heard about the fact that Rupavahini was starting, he casually said to me, well, would you like to come over to our station and see how it works? And because I was so bored, anything was better than, I was struggling with Latin at the time. I was studying languages. Anything was better than sitting in class with Latin. I said, yes, please. And so I became, in fact, the first ever apprentice foreign national that they'd taken on, apprentice or trainee. So I spent 3 months there. And that was my opening to the world of television. I followed a production crew. And actually, the first time I ever saw my face on a TV screen, I was so horrified. I thought, never, never again. But anyway, so with the 3 months behind me and not thinking much more of it, I came to Sri Lanka for my usual vacation in the summer of 82. My father was with the UN at this time, and he was passing through here. And he, I guess, worked a little magic and said, well, would you like to meet the chairman of Rupavahini? Maybe you can, get a little job there or do a summer job or something. So we went and met MJ Pereira, who wasn't too pleased. I think he thought, who are these people and why are they bothering me and what do they want? But when he said, well, what have you been doing? And I mentioned the 3 months of training, then his attention peaked because he said to me, well, we have just started. We need people with even a modicum of experience, and you speak English and whatever. Would you like to join? And so I say in the book, when he said that, I must have said, well, join as what? And so I was offered the position, the most lowly position, that of trainee production assistant. And he decided to put me in the Western music unit. And so that was my entry to Rupavahini as a very junior production assistant in the Western music unit in August 1982, which was just 6 months after the station was launched. So yeah, that's how it all began for me.
Ajita, I've got to point out that lots of people listening to this will not be familiar with most of this background. My understanding is that JR became president in 1977. Is that right?
Oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot too there. I'm terrible
Well,
with
I think
dates.
it was roughly about 77. Let's say 77. Let's just call it 77 for the moment.
Okay,
That's
yep.
when he got elected. So this is a short time after he got elected, and you're mentioning that then from that
Yeah.
then they started doing the research in 1978. So well, I think it's quite an exciting beginning. Before TV, Sri Lanka had a thriving radio output with maybe at least three or more channels, including English and Tamil output, alongside the majority Sinhalese output. Radio included commercials, and there was a wealth of output, including music and soaps. Radio remained the dominant medium for news and current affairs and is still very important. Can you talk about how that radio might have contributed towards the television, and that we mustn't really forget about that radio aspect, should we?
Absolutely, Rajit. And it was only when I started researching this book that I realized how closely tied SLBC or Radio Ceylon was, and what a role they played in the birth of Rupavahini. So Radio Ceylon, those history buffs will recall that Radio Ceylon was launched in 1925. And it was the first radio station in Asia, and in fact, the second oldest in the world. So it had very high standards of production and presentation in English and, of course, in Sinhala too. I mean, people would tune in I know people tune in from India, and they still do, but it was seen as an exemplary station with very high standards. And I think they maintained that for decades afterwards. The whole radio scene now is very different, of course. But yeah, so Radio Ceylon, SLBC, of course, had highly qualified technical people. And as they went along, of course, very, very proficient presenters and producers. And as you say, yeah, their output was amazing. I mean, the news was very high quality. And then they had dramas and competitions. And I mean, it was all we had. It was all people had. And so I think they really did cater to their audience in every possible way. Fast forwarding a bit, Livy Vijayamana was one of the pioneers of the English service and a former chairman, and he became the first to introduce private radio in Sri Lanka. So the first private radio station in 1993 was called FM 99. And this was under the license granted to him. And in fact, he invited me, together with several others, to be a consultant. So in the early days, we were there trying to figure out, and this is interesting, what kind of people we should recruit, what kind of music we should play. And when we thought about what kind of people we should recruit, we felt we should have people of Sri Lankan origin or with a Sri Lankan accent. As you can see now, that is very far from, or rather, I mean, things have changed, right? We have all these accents floating around. We resisted that initially because we thought we should keep it quote unquote local, but that's just by the way. So 1993 was the start of private radio stations, and look at where we are today. I mean, how many radio stations in all three languages, catering to different tastes in music, and yeah, we've seen great progress. But I think that, yeah.
You mentioned a gentleman called Vijay Mani, is that right?
Livy Vijayamani, yes.
Vijay Vijay Mani. Okay, all right, carry on.
Yeah. He was a wonderful man, quite a character, also passed away. Yeah, so while radio was very prominent, in fact, dominant, it was the dominant media, I think it did suffer a little bit when Rupavahini and ITN came along. But I think now with the influx of private stations, radio plays a huge role because it's on in everyone's car and office and at home, and it's just part of your life. But the downside is today, in my opinion, and in English, in the English stations in particular, is that the standard, and I talk about English radio news, the standard is pretty appalling, I would say. I mean, I listen to the news on radio, and I used to train people in news reading and presentation. So the standard of the news readers is pretty bad because you have all these very young sounding voices. They don't project any professionalism. Their voices are high pitched. They make mistake after mistake live on air. And I don't see anything being done to correct this. So I'm very disappointed in the standard of news reading. The news scripts, of course, are absolutely appalling because they're just taken off Reuters or off whatever the source they're using. They're not tailored or trimmed. And I don't think the average person understands a word. So I find it very frustrating to listen to news on the radio. Music, of course, is great because back in the day, of course, we have to remember that SLBC, from the 70s onwards, they had no access to foreign music. There was a time when, as with everything in the 70s, we were very limited and constricted. So they had to play the same old music over and over. They weren't able to have the latest music. Which is why, if you think back, and if you remember, I don't know if you remember, people like Jim Reeves and Engelbert Humperdinck became so popular. I mean, they were great, but it's simply because that's the only things we had in our library.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Well, I think that's quite hilarious, actually. That's very interesting to hear. Well, I mean, okay, standards might have fallen, but we are now dwelling on this wonderful time when television is being launched from the inception of Radio Ceylon in 100 years ago. So coming on to the television once again and the history of it, Ajita, there was a talented chairman of Rupavahini, but the organization was often short of funds. How did they do things on a tight budget?
Yeah, so at the outset itself, I have to mention, and I think everyone agrees, all those of us who were there from the beginning, that the founding chairman, M.J. Pereira, was the absolute best choice. I mean, he was immensely qualified. He was a qualified and talented and experienced administrator. I mean, he had served in so many institutions and ministries, and I mean, he was just an incredible man. So he was the right pick to be the founding president because he had founding chairman. He had all this experience behind him. And also he was a strong character who at that time, there wasn't too much interference, but he wasn't about to let anyone interfere in the running of the station. I mean, he kept political interference to the minimum. So all thanks and gratitude go to him. Now, you talk about doing things on a tight budget. I'm just going to try and find this page where you would be amazed to know how Rupavahini started with basically, I mean, the building was great. The Japanese had built us this amazing building. It was almost too small, though, actually, to cater to all the units that eventually came up. But I don't think anyone had thought about the budget. No budget had been allocated for the running of the station. So would you believe that, and I quote here from the book, when the SLRC Act was passed by Parliament on January 22, 1982, now this is the original finance director talking here, he realized that we had to open an account, but we didn't have money. And he says, I walked across to SLBC. Now, the other great thing is that I think the fact that SLBC and Rupavahini were positioned opposite each other, we just had to cross the street, played a huge role in the sort of symbiotic relationship and the ease of operations that happened, because it was just a hop, skip, and a jump. So he walked across to SLBC to borrow a sum of 50,000 rupees from the director of finance to open an account for Rupavahini. And then he walks to the Bank of Ceylon, Independence Square branch, because he didn't even have a vehicle. This is how simple things were. And his first official duty for the corporation was to open a bank account. And he says, I wondered whether I was the first head of finance of a public entity who had to borrow funds to open a current account. I mean, that's how things began, right? And I recall in the book also, and all of this is based on personal stories and memories, first-hand accounts. There was no furniture. I mean, there were a couple of desks. And the chairman, M.J. Pereira, he wasn't one to waste money. He didn't want to buy fancy stuff. He ended up buying very simple furniture from a place called, I think it was Borewood, sort of rubber wood furniture, and which is what we had for many, many years. He was very, very cautious about how he spent money. So, yeah. So the other thing about Rupavahini is, because we were able to get so many people from across the road, the bulk of the commercial division, people came from SLBC. And mind you, they didn't even have a place. They didn't have office space. They were operating from SLBC initially. But what enabled SLRC to hit the ground running was because of all the experienced commercial programming experts who were brought over. So the commercial division was the backbone, because they are the ones who brought in the money. So from day one, we had to go after sponsorship and advertising. Advertising was the main source of income. And we'll talk about, teledramas, foreign programs, and films. All of that was made possible only because we were able to get sponsorship. And I must say, back in the day, some of the top companies, they really did step up to the plate in terms of sponsoring really good stuff back in the day. So the commercial division also, just to give them due credit, maintained from day one very strict ethical and broadcasting standards. They had a code of ethics. For instance, children could not be used. Medical products, doctors could not sell, or promote medical products. All of that was taken care of. And so the early days were interesting. I mean, there are all kinds of stories in the book where people try to buy their way in, or to, get their programs on air through devious means. All of that is talked about in the book. Very, very interesting times. And one memory I recall is that this amazing commercial division had only one phone. I mean, we're talking about the days of land phones. One landline, which sat on the director's table, and whenever the phone rang, everybody would come running to, if it was their call, they would take it from there. This is how simple and basic things were back in the day. And, to me, it's amazing. It's amazing what they did.
Well, I mean, I can remember how children like us monitored the rise of television growth by witnessing the antennas on roofs. It was exactly the same when TV entered other countries, the rise of the antennas. But it didn't disrupt playtimes, as initially transmissions only started at about 6 p.m. and ended around midnight. So this kind of night transmission might have been one way that you were saving money. But how many, like you are talking about a commercial division, so presumably there would have been a non-commercial division. So was it like 2 channels or 3 channels to begin with? Can you remember?
No, Rajat. Rupavahini was just Rupavahini. Okay. And we broadcast from, I think, 6 p.m. to around midnight. But don't forget, this was a trilingual station. We had to balance content in 3 languages. So the news in 3 languages, teledramas. I mean, everything had to be balanced out, and you had to give room for Buddhist programs, and then later on a Muslim unit came up, and there was even a Christian a unit that tried to give Christians their share of religious programs. It was a massive balancing act. But I like your recollection of, yes, so TV started at 6, and I can talk for my son, who was just a child then. You're right, playtime went on as usual. But then by 6 o'clock, and by 6 o'clock, what, the sun starts going down, it's getting dark. The kids would rush in to watch their cartoons and kids programs. Um, so initially, now the other thing to remember is that Rupavahini's mandate was um, educating and entertaining. So children's programming was always a priority. And it was very strong from the get-go. There were specific art and educational programs in addition to the fun stuff. You know, the song and dance programs and a lot of group studio programs where groups of kids would come in, and storytelling and all of that. So that was the early part of the evening. And then, of course, we had to get in informative programs, news, documentaries, light entertainment, drama, and film. So that was a lot in the early years to cram in to these few hours until, of course, the time of starting time started, becoming earlier and earlier. So in terms of children's programs, if I can just mention, there was one program in particular, Rajat, which was quite phenomenal. It was called Mutuhara, and it was a children's program. But it went on to become something quite amazing because they created clubs. So kids would come into the studio, do their thing. The program was great, but it didn't end there. Areas and towns, cities created Mutuhara clubs, which then motivated kids to, get active, and out of these clubs came some amazing child presenters who all admit that later on in life, this exposure that they had really took them places. And then not only in Sri Lanka, but and one example actually is in London. They have, and still have, I think, a huge fan base and a huge Mutuhara club, which opened up so many horizons, so that kids who are no longer in Sri Lanka still have a connection, and they can keep this whole thing going. This was quite exceptional. I think Rupavahini really paved the way. We can talk later if you want about other things like cartoons and dubbing. Did you want to
Well,
go into
I'm
something
coming
else?
to. I'm just covering. Let's just. I'm trying to.
Mhm.
The local Rupavahini relied on a lot of imports from Germany and Russia. There were German and BBC documentaries, um, often a little bit out of date United States television,
Mhm.
such as Sesame Street, um, and and Big Blue Marble. Was the local output a growing portfolio? And can you comment about the imports? I mean, you've just mentioned Mutuhara, but in the beginning, actually, the mainstay, a great deal of the mainstay did come from abroad, didn't it? And that's actually not a bad thing, even for children.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, initially we were totally dependent on imported foreign programs, which of course were expensive. And this is why I think the key embassies in Sri Lanka really did a great job by providing, music, well, music also, but movies and documentaries. Some of those key embassies were, of course, the Embassy of Japan, as you mentioned, Germany, Russia, uh, of course, and then we had access to BBC documents, which all of it was a little out of date, as you say, but we did have access to some of the best programs out there. Um, but local production took off fairly soon. Now, it's important that people understand. So Rupavahini began in 1982. A year later, by July of 1983, what happened? We were thrown into a state of absolute chaos because July 83 signaled the start of the war. And then, of course, we had the JVP uprising in 89. So almost from the get-go, Rupavahini had to face the worst of conditions and yet keep this national TV station going. One interesting story which I cover in the book is that in 1984, and once again, remember programs in English, Sinhala, and Tamil. In 1984, a team from the Tamil unit went to Jaffna, a whole bunch of them. It was a major trip with their equipment, and they stayed there and recorded 20 programs in Tamil, of course, because they were finding it hard to get people to come to the studio. Even in Colombo, no one wanted to venture out much. And there was a dearth of acting talent. So they went to Jaffna to film 20 programs, which they brought back and edited, and which really saw them through with repeat telecasts, of course, which was really, really during those key difficult years that saw them through. Similarly, though, soon after the beginning, we developed the whole teledrama concept, right? And I think that's the main role that Rupavahini played, was initiating the concept of the teledrama. And there's quite a lot in the book that talks about that. So that involved, again, going out shooting on location, which was a cost factor, and then actually getting these programs sponsored, which wasn't always easy. But pretty much from the start, they started to do their own programming, because you had to cater to the singular local audiences, right? So those were interesting times, but I really do think we need to be grateful to all the foreign countries who helped us out initially.
Well, I completely agree. One of my best memories is that they actually aired the entire 13 episodes of Carl Sagan's Cosmos in the 1980s,
Right.
which actually many children, even in Britain, were deprived of. Now, so carrying on, as with TV the world over, events like the Russian Olympics in 1984 and the British royal wedding were covered on the television. I can remember my grandmother glued to her set during the royal wedding. What was the editorial like, and how much freedom did it have as a state broadcaster?
Well, now the thing here, Rajat, is that we're talking about, so the royal wedding was in 81 and the Olympics were in 80. This was
Sorry,
before
yes,
Rupavahini
yes.
started. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I do remember that they.
No. Oh,
I
absolutely no. But what you're mistaking is that it was ITN. It was because
ITN.
Rupavahini hadn't started. Yes, so which is still very much part of our history, because
Okay.
it's the same people.
Yes.
Oh yes, my gosh. So I do dwell on that. So so ITN transmitted both, and my gosh, the technical hoops they had to jump through. So basically, the stuff was coming in on satellite, and in the case of which came first, 80, the Olympics. There's a fascinating chapter here on how they did it. So basically, you had the issue of the system, because we were broadcasting in PAL, right, which was the system. I'm missing the word right now, but anyway, the shots were coming in on Seacom. So what they did was, I mean, this was so clever. They would shoot what was coming in live off a screen in Seacom, and then re-record it in PAL, and then those cassettes had to be transported to Panipitia, which is where the transmission station was, for broadcast. And so while it was coming in live, I mean, obviously there was a delay. It wasn't live from our end, but there was this whole gymnastics of recording cassette after cassette, because I mean, the Olympics went on for how many days? I don't know back then. Cassette after cassette had to be taken to Panipitia for transmission. And it was quite amazing that we managed to do it. Now, you asked about editorial. So it's the visual that mattered, really, because anyway, whatever commentaries came in would have been in English and would have been carried as such. We weren't able to translate into Sinhala back then. But so this went on, and I mean, those boys did an amazing job. Similarly, the next year in 81, when we had the royal wedding, I titled this little chapter "Live but Not Quite," because the stuff was coming in live, but then we had to go through this whole rigmarole of re-recording and physically taking the cassettes to the station. And for instance, it says here, somebody recalled how 3 vehicles and 3 officers were assigned to maintain the shuttle service of the cassettes from Paduka to ITN every 20 minutes for the duration of the entire live telecast of the royal wedding. So our guys were so creative and so ingenious, in the way they did it. The show had to go on, and they made sure it went on.
Well, I'm really grateful, Ajita, that you're pointing out some of my false dates because
Oh no,
I think
believe
that
me, a lot of us picked it up.
there's a segue between ITN and Rupavahini, and clearly when my
Right,
grandmother was glued to the royal wedding, that would have been much earlier, and the Olympics.
exactly.
And I also seem to remember that there was a kind of live output about the assassination of the Egyptian president Sadat as well, that I seem to
Would have
remember.
been.
Yeah.
Mm.
So actually, I'm not really sure if the dates coincide, but anyway. So we're talking about the editorial. I mean, Rupavahini was a state broadcaster. Any comment about the extent to which television was used as a government information service versus propaganda?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we have to admit that it was pretty propagandistic in nature. Um, yeah, let me just read up this little thing. So from day one, we had a very strong research unit. They were given priority because the powers that be understood the importance of research. They did some research, and I think I'll just quote this if you don't mind. They say, sometimes our research revealed things that the authorities did not want to see or hear. For example, a content analysis of TV news revealed that SLRC's news hardly had quote unquote news value or novelty factor and was filled with events attended by politicians, such as ceremonial openings of this and that, which the politicians arranged and attended. We, the research unit, we were able to show how the news content was dominated by the pecking order of the political leadership of the day. To our surprise, after seeing some of those results, then President J.R. Jayawardena advised Rupavahini not to show his face in excess. And in brackets, the person says, excess, of course, is subject to definition. So yes, right, I think that gives you an idea. It was all about keeping the ministries and the politicians. Everybody wanted their 5 seconds of fame, right? This was a new media. It was like huge. Their face, coming on the screen all over the country. What better way to, promote themselves? So looking at it from our point of view, because I was working in the newsroom at this time, it was pretty horrible. I remember having so many arguments and being so resistant with our news director. Whenever he assigned me to go, we would all be assigned for the day to go and cover this, that, or the other. I would say, Mr. Patil, this is not news. Has no news value. Why do I have to go? And he would appease me by saying, "What to do, my dear?" Call me my dear. "What to do, my dear? Please just go and do something." Because this was rubbish. Sometimes literally the opening of a building or the handing over of a book or handing over this, that, and the other. It was awful. But then again, and then there were times, believe me, Rajat, when I put in effort to do something, I preferred the more cultural beat or the offbeat stuff. I would do it, and it was difficult to get the facilities to edit and to voice also. I would do something, and it would be slotted in the time in the lineup of the news for the day, and then at the very last minute it would get pulled out. Why? Because so and so or some minister or somebody needed to have their little bit put in, and this is how it was. But having said that, so the news, I mean, that's how it was, okay? But in terms of other government information, there were a lot of documentaries, and in a good way, about development programs like the Mahaveli program. I mean, this was the peak of the Mahaveli time. Gamudava, President Premadas's village reawakening, various housing programs, a lot of development programs, which, I mean, they served their purpose, right? I mean, people needed to know what was going on in the country. Sometimes they were tedious to watch, but anyway. Two other things.
Yes.
Can I just mention? Oh dear, I forget which came first. Let's say Asia Vision. So Asia Vision was our regional news exchange, and I worked with them for a while. Every day we would propose several items from each country: India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. We would propose news items, and they would accept one or two. Now, this all started off okay, but after a while, again, this was seen as a propagandistic tool. A ministry would say, "Oh, well, why don't we send our item?" Or a minister would say, "Why don't we send our item?" And it didn't necessarily have news value. And who cared? Who could have cared less in those countries where we were opening a new, I don't know, new toilet or a new, literally that pathetic. And then after that, we had the CNN World Report, and I was one of the pioneer presenters. But there too, after a while, people caught on, well, the people in power caught on to what a great propaganda tool this was. This is not just Asia, but the whole world could see what we were sending from Sri Lanka. And so instead of sending really good, solid stuff, again, it became a tool for just sending garbage. And by that time, I pulled out because I just wasn't interested in towing the line on that. So, in a nutshell, that's what we had to contend with back then.
Well, Ajita, I mean, half in jest, it could be argued that things are just as bad, if not worse, in the modern day world with regards to news output compared to what it was then. Now, you've already mentioned that there was a lot of control on sex and violence, so that's also part of the editorial and things like that. I mean, actually, what to keep at bay would have been more of a problem about that than what to include. So there was control over sex and violence and things like that.
Absolutely. And this particularly when we were importing programs like, all of the American serials, for example, lots of violence and guns. And so never mind the sex, no kissing, no physical contact. So the interesting thing was we had of all the many units we had, the program presentation unit, I would say from day one, they had a preview panel which they had to preview every single episode of every single program series, and they had to provide a report on everything that they previewed. And the kissing scenes, of course, certainly had to be blurred. Now, this is easier than it sounds. Never mind the censoring part. They then had to go to the MCR, the control room, get the machines, go through the whole thing, find the scenes that were offensive, cut them out. And it's not always easy to cut something out without putting something else in, which is why sometimes things seem disjointed, But so early series, if we think back, Dynasty, X-Files, Hawaii Five, or Charlie's Angels, were all heavily censored. And for me, coming from the West, and seeing the same shows that I would have seen there, but obviously noticing all the edits and the censorship, it was really frustrating. I mean, the locals might not have known, but I found it very frustrating. So yes, there was a lot of control because, I mean, I have to say that as the national station, we had to uphold the morals and values of the nation, right? That is debatable, I don't know, today's context, and you can't control it that much today with the internet. But back then we did our very best to, control things, especially in households. And don't forget, this was the beginning of TV, TV came to see a movie, you went out. TV came into your home, into the sanctity of your living room, where it had to be, parents, grandparents, children, everyone sitting around the TV had to be able to watch what was coming into their homes. So it was quite difficult. You can imagine how difficult it was to keep that balance in making things interesting, yet sort of safe and morally acceptable.
We were ironically both fairly fortunate in one way of interpreting to grow up all our part of our childhoods without television. As this technology was almost inevitably would you say that this was the end of an age of innocence? And just for information, I mean, it has recently been revealed that the rates of short-sightedness in children has soared, and a lot of this is attributable to children spending too much time indoors watching things on a screen. So outdoors time is probably better for the eyes. So the fact that was this the age of a sort of an age of innocence, at least from a Sri Lankan perspective?
Well, Rajita, you and I mean, like everyone else, we have issues with our eyes now. But all of what's happening today is these damn cell phones, right? Because everybody is on their phone morning, noon, and night. Back then, I think, there was a certain distance between the screen and like we said, kids still went out and played, and then they came back in, but then they had to do their homework and have their dinner and go to bed. So I don't think they were overexposed per se. I mean, I discovered TV at the age of 11 in the UK. And I grew up like most of us of my generation with only radio and cinema. And we had brilliant childhoods, didn't we?
Yes.
I mean, cycling, games, outdoors. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yes.
Today's kids, though, oh my God, my heart breaks for them. My son maybe was the last of the generation who enjoyed the outdoors and wasn't obsessed with TV screens, TV games. And certainly we had no cell phones back then. But on the positive side, the advent of TV, it did open new windows to the world, right, in terms of education and information. And I mean, there's no going back. It was a necessary move, and I think Rupavahini did as much as it could back then to control, maybe control is not a good word, but to make sure that the right things were shown at the right time, in the right doses, so that children, and don't forget, we had an educational arm as well, ETV, which wasn't unfortunately that successful, but as I said, Rupavahini's mandate was to educate and inform. That was, that their legal mandate. And I think, they did a great job.
Well, Ajita, fascinating. Amongst the most popular output on television were old Sinhalese films broadcast, I seem to remember, on Friday nights. Such output probably brought the nation together. Can you comment about the most popular output?
Once again, Rajan, we need to go back to the fact that this was a dismal time in our history, 82, 83 onwards, right? Once the war had started, it was difficult for people to go out. I mean, cinemas, obviously the cinema felt the brunt of it. So everything had to come into your home. And therefore, I think Rupavahini and consequently the other stations played a huge role in keeping families together, keeping them entertained. And as I said, I've given a lot of space in the book to the advent of the teledrama format, which I think, Rupavahini can take most of the credit for introducing it. And we had amazing teledramas from 82 onwards, Demutu Mutu, Palingu Manike, and Gamperaliya, of course, Gamperaliya 1988, and Amayalwa 1988 also. Those were two key productions done by Rupavahini people, which really caught the hearts of the audiences. And even today, they're repeated over and over, and they still have that amazing impact. So television brought about a whole new generation of actors, singers, new formats. And of course, it became a huge income earner because anything that we did was new. And, and I must say the advertising agencies were great support. There were, a key, I mean, I don't know how it is today, but there were the key leading agencies back in the day who really rallied round. I mean, it was a win-win situation, but sponsorship, we couldn't have functioned without sponsorship. So my key take on that is that definitely TV played a key role in maintaining family unity, keeping people informed. I mean, so then now we had the war. People wanted to know what was going on. And Rupavahini, we were sending crews to the north, to Jaffna, to cover the war. Excuse me, I just have to take a sip of water. And towards the late 80s and early 90s, we actually established mini broadcasting stations within the army camps up in the north. And we would send crews, I think they would go for 2 weeks at a time. They would fly out there in army planes and run the show because transmission stations had been, the Tigers had attacked the transmission stations, so they weren't receiving stuff from Colombo. So that's the extent to which Rupavahini took its responsibility as a broadcaster to the nation to heart. And there are some great stories from guys who spent time there, great and sad stories too, of them witnessing colleagues and fellow, army friends being killed, and oh gosh, the awful times that they went through there. So yeah, Rupavahini really, in retrospect, 43 years later, did a phenomenal job.
Well, Ajita, I'm afraid I've got to confess that my own exposure was limited to a very, very narrow time band. So I can remember that what school children talked about was, at least in the school I was going to at Royal, was Britain's Blake 7. And then there was also music programs and something called the King Claude Show. Care to comment about how hard it was for local programming in competing with that foreign output?
So as we discussed earlier, yes, initially we needed the foreign stuff to keep going. But like I said, very quickly we started doing our own stuff. So, excuse me. As I said, Mutuhara quickly became a hit and created a huge network and had a tremendous hold on children here. And then, we had award-winning films such as a series, rather, such as Ambayalwa. And the teledrama field was really moving very fast. But then I think this might be the point to talk about the role of dubbing cartoons, cartoons and animation. And so I think everyone knows the name Titus Totawatta. He was the guy who brought in the art of dubbing foreign cartoons. And even then, creating our own cartoons or animation. So when dubbing, we're talking about dubbing English content into Sinhala, a major process. And oh my gosh, he and his and his team, his right-hand man was Atula. They did a brilliant job. I mean, I'm trying to remember some of the things that might. What was it? Dr. Dolittle. What was it called? Honda Hitler, I think, was a classic cartoon. So this is not as easy as it may seem, because you have to translate the nuances of what's being said, right?
Yes.
So they brought in well-known actors and voice artists, and it was a whole process. There was a whole unit eventually dedicated to dubbing cartoons. And then later on, of course, we got the imported series, a lot of the Korean. Well, how about Oshin? Everyone remembers Oshin, the Japanese series, right? And so this team, I mean, they were revolutionary in what they did, and brought a whole new dimension to television. And of course, I mean, attracted a whole new audience. And I mean, anybody who grew up watching that stuff will never forget it. Its impact was lasting. So he remains a hero, and I know today that the dubbing unit and the animation unit have grown and grown and grown. And of course, with the advent of technology now, what they can do is there are no limits. But back then, I mean, there were limits back then. So hats off to these guys in the beginning for doing what they did.
Well, it's good, really great to hear about the launch of new talent. And Sri Lankan television increased coverage of existing stars like Amaradeva, Victor Ratnayaka, and Nanda Malini, and perhaps helped launch fresh entertainment and other talent or at a mass level.
Yeah, so by the time Rupavahini came in, I mean, obviously because of radio, we had our established stars and performers. But we have to remember now these radio artists were literally walking across the road into a visual medium. Now, when you're on radio, no one sees you, no one cares. You're just behind a mic. And suddenly they had to face the camera. Now, as I said, me having come from the West, this was a bit strange for me, because if I just quote one line, it always struck me how rigid and motionless the local Sinhala and Tamil musicians and singers were on the early TV shows. They would stand ramrod stiff, looking somewhat constipated, and belt out the lyrics with minimal facial expressions. Now, this is because they weren't used to having to look at the camera or perform, right? So it took a long time, I think, and maybe even a generation of performers to get used to relating to the camera, knowing which camera to look at. You know what I mean? Smiling. I don't know. It was a whole different world. But this is the huge role that Rupavahini played in bringing about new talent. And some of the popular shows were Nandana Vindana, Manohari, many more. I was involved in one called Savasangita, which was a monthly program, co-produced and co-produced by Rupavahini, SLBC, and the Sri Lanka Foundation. And so our mandate was to bring in fresh new talent from around the country. And every month we had this program, which was recorded live with the Sri Lanka Foundation. And that in itself created a whole bunch of problems. It was quite tedious. But yeah, so by the mid 80s, we had this explosion of musical programs. And I worked in the Western music unit. So we were promoting Western music talent, you know, the English performers and singers. And gosh, people loved it because there was nowhere else they could see them. I mean, they had their Sinhala stuff, but where else could they see English, unless they went to the nightclubs? Where else could they see the top English talent performing? So yeah, we achieved, I think, great things in those early years. And people still remember and are grateful. That's the great thing.
Well, I mean, speaking about talent, people often forget the technical talent, and you're probably a star of this technical talent. The technical talent, such as directors, producers, editors, and camera operatives. Was there a steep learning curve and new talent created, including your expertise as a writer or director?
Yes and no, because a lot of the best cameramen came from the government film unit, right? So they were steeped in doing things in a different way, film work, but they made the transition. And similarly, people from the world of cinema and theater. There was a huge influx of people from theater, from the Sinhala theater. and they formed the backbone of the Sinhala, the drama unit. So yes, there was a steep learning curve technically because they had to get used to now this new format of cameras and lighting and microphones. But that was the challenge. I mean, it was a challenge, and it was a creative. An amazing time, and I do dwell quite a bit on this in the book with first-hand stories, and also it was a matter of setting standards. Now, Rupavahini did play a great role in setting the standards for teledramas and what was to come. I have to say, I think today, I mean, I don't watch much, but I don't think I could because, frankly, I don't think the quality is that good. But our initial group of people at Rupavahini came from very strong backgrounds in cinema and theater. And yeah, so we discovered a lot of new talent along the way. For me, I was working in the news room at the time. My learning curve was in writing scripts for news items, and also I was doing documentaries and magazine programs. So as you know, with television, the words have to match the visual. But for us, I have to say the struggle always was access to equipment. You know, everyone's now running around like crazy, wanting to do this and that, and we had only a limited number of screens to preview material, limited number of editing suites. Everything was a rush. In retrospect, I was like, I think sometimes we just spent our time running around like headless chickens, and we couldn't invest enough time into actually doing the productions and making sure that the output was, you know, there was always someone breathing down your neck. Next in line for editing. Okay, are you done? Are you done? Move on. It was frantic. But you talked about steep learning curve. Yeah, it really was. But it was the best of times. It was the worst of times, but it was the best of times.
During the Civil War, the country lost money and the culture collapsed somewhat. The movie industry seemed to collapse. Did TV help in any way to maintain any kind of culture or cultural
Absolutely. So
output?
So we talked about how cinema was affected, and Rupavahini stepped up to the plate in terms of the teledramas and locally produced shows. The main area in which I think Rupavahini really played a key role was in the news coverage, as I mentioned, because it brought the reality of the war into people's homes. Yes, there was censorship, strict censorship about what you could show and what you could talk about. But it's still, if not for Rupavahini at that time, in that era, people wouldn't have known what was going on or wouldn't have seen. I mean, yes, they would have read the newspapers, but there's nothing like seeing. And I mean, nobody wants to see. The girls in the library, a bunch of young girls, every day had to go through these cassettes of rushes, of raw footage brought in from the field, from the war zone. And my God, how traumatic for them, watching people getting blown up, bodies lying around. This is what they had to do every single day. The library also played a huge role in maintaining the archives and making it accessible for anyone who needed to use those visuals. But especially in the late 80s and early 90s, Rupavahini's role in broadcasting, as I mentioned, from Palali Army Camp in Jaffna to enable the northern population to have access to TV was tremendous. So along with the war going on and all the negativity that was going on and the sense of hopelessness, it was a time of huge development and growth for Rupavahini. And again, they really did step up to the plate.
Okay. Today there are more stations than ever before. I don't really know how many, and a relatively free media. Is the media relatively free, or is it very largely commercially driven?
Oh, this tagline, free media is highly debatable. I mean, I would say today, and with there being so many stations, today we are freer than we were in the 80s and 90s. There was, as we've said, a lot of control and a lot of censorship, which was necessary because of the war in many ways. And also we had the political agendas of various politicians, you know, sort of interfering in the news in particular. And I think I said at the beginning, everyone wanted their 5 seconds of fame. So the news director's job was a miserable job, having to keep everyone at bay and keep the show going and try and, you know, present a balanced view. It was never easy. Yeah, today, of course, we have, yes, how many stations do we have? And their coverage of the news. See, today, I mean, it's a different world, right? With the internet, everyone can call themselves a citizen journalist. Everyone has a phone camera and video and, real-time sharing. Back in the day, I have to say that we did have at one point what we call them provincial reporters. These were guys out in the boonies who had, very basic video, if you remember, video cameras back then, who would record items of news value in their area and then either physically bring to Colombo or send through some kind of courier service. And that was the only way often we were able to cover regional news. Now, today, look at today. Somebody standing on a street in Jaffna or Gaul can record something, send it to us. If it's acceptable, we will use it, kind of thing. And that's what many stations, they work off that system now. The difference again, and today, I mean, we can't even compare the advent and the growth of podcasts, as we are doing here, but video podcasts and self-produced content is breaking all barriers. I mean, that is the biggest takeaway I see from how things have changed and how people are pushing the boundaries of free media. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of irresponsibility and maybe, ethics are not what they were, but there's no going back now. I mean, the internet has brought that upon us.
Well, I have to say that I find modern day Sri Lankan television, especially the news, largely unwatchable. But my aunt loves her Sinhalese teledramas. Now the news editing is quite violent and it's quite commercial. You got these very, very violent cuts in modern day news. Was Sri Lankan was the news coverage in this context in the past more watchable? I feel it was somehow.
Oh yes, I think so. And I'll tell you why. Because we didn't have all these gadgets and these gimmicks and effects to play around with. See, one of the basic concepts of editing is you cannot cut from one. So for instance, if I'm interviewing you, your face is on the screen. You say something, and I want to cut out a little bit, but then get back to you. I can't just use a jump cut, meaning take one section of you and then just stick it onto the next. I need to have something in between. So we had what we called, cutaways, which was you would cut away to some other visual, now, I mean, I'm absolutely appalled. You're quite right when you say news editing is violent, because now we see, I don't know the exact term, I think it's called a white flash. So on TV, you'll see someone talking, and literally every few seconds there's a white flash. It's like a flash, camera flash going off, right? Do people realize what is happening there? This person's speech is being trimmed and cut and chopped between almost every other word. So what we're saying is every and ah and every sneeze and cough and every hesitation is being cut down and shortened for time and therefore for commercial purposes. Let's cram more in. But it is very, very hard on the eye. It's brutal, and I do question the ethics of it, because accuracy and interpretation suffers. So I am quite alarmed, really, at the use of all these editing techniques in the news. Teledramas, you mentioned, they were, and they still are, in my opinion, painfully slow-paced. The acting is one-dimensional, and I'm afraid it's not my cup of tea. But I just don't see it changing. Maybe people have got so used to it, and that's what they want. I mean, you cannot. My other thing, Roger, is that we cannot now be like frogs in a well. The outside world is there. The internet exposes us to everything. We can't say, oh, this is the Sri Lankan way of doing it, or this is the Sri Lankan standard, because you have to maintain certain standards. I'm talking about a movie that I went to see the other day, which is The Talk of the Town, about a certain personality. And I was really, really very, very disappointed in the way it was done. Because you can't just do things our way anymore. There's standards to maintain. The whole world is open. You can go online. You can see how it's done. You can't do substandard stuff anymore. That's what I'm saying. Substandard production, substandard editing, programming is not acceptable, because we can see what's going on in the rest of the world. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but this kind of annoys me, this whole
Well, I
situation.
suppose that the best one could say is that we have had our crop of fantastic directors, at least in the movie industry. And there are probably other parts of the world where things are much, much worse. But there is room for improvement, clearly. You mentioned that
Yeah.
you had to get this book out because so many of your past co-workers had died. Your book also encapsulates their voices and perhaps represents an archive as much as history. To what extent is your book a personal narrative as opposed to lots and lots of information funneled in from other people as well? Did you have problems integrating that kind of all those, well, your
No,
story
Raj,
with other people's story?
yeah, no, from the get-go, it wasn't going to be my voice. I'm just the sort of, I just pull it all together. And where I do give my opinions or my stories, I put my name. Basically, anyone who's contributed is named within the page. And then I have 30 pages of a reference section for everyone who's mentioned by name where they can be found, by page. So I'm just pulling the whole narrative together, but it is definitely the voice of every single person who contributed, plus the stuff that I researched and newspaper clippings from back in the day, archival stuff. But it is everyone who contributed, and there wouldn't have been a book if people hadn't contributed. So it is their voice, and then I dedicate the book to all those people who were the pioneers. It is the voice of the pioneers. And yes, so many people passed away from age or from health issues. I tried to keep track, and in the end, I had to give up. But I want to say it's in the double figures, if not even over 100 in that particular time frame. I mean, they were passing away anyways. But I'm just so glad I managed to get their stories. And if you don't mind, if we have time, I'd like to just talk about how important it is to. I mean, we talk about urban legends or cult history. And I wanted to preserve some of these stories because I think they fall into that category. So two of those events were, one was the May Day bomb blast, which killed President Premadasa. And
That's
and
about
the other was
about
90,
1991, isn't it? 1990,
93,
93,
yes.
sorry. Yes,
93,
1993.
yes. So
Okay.
there's this story, where is it? 253. So a news crew was sent out to cover the May Day rally, right? And there were two Rohitas actually. The cameraman's name was Rohita. So was the recordist. And I'm not finding the page, so I'm just going to tell it to you from memory. Anyway, so they were out following President Premadasa, and at one point he said, "Look, well, why don't you cover this and this aspect from there?" He was moving around in a jeep and sometimes walking. Anyway, so they were on the job. And time was going by, and this was going to be a long day. So Rohita, the recordist, said to the guys, why don't we go and get a snack because we're not going to make lunch? And he, famous for his love of food. And so literally they stepped into what would have been a kade back then. As the food was placed on the table, they heard the sound of the explosion. And when they rushed out, there was nothing but body parts left of President Premadasa. So the story is, and the way that the guys tell it is that, well, Rohita's stomach saved the day. His urgent need for food and his gluttony, if you were, who had saved the day. And that story has come down through the years. And the other one was, so we had this director, very senior. He had come from SLBC. Mr. S.P. Jayasundara. He was in charge of the OB bus, the outside broadcast bus, and all outside live coverages. Now, they'd gone to Kandy, and they had parked the OB bus, if you remember, the big orange bus, and parked probably where they shouldn't. And some very junior policeman came and said, what are you all doing here? You can't park here. Who parked here? Who gave you permission to park here? And Mr. Jayasundara confronted the young cop, and he'd asked Mr. Jayasundara, who are you? And Mr. Jayasundara said, I'm SP Jayasundara. So the joke is that, that SP stands for what? Senior Superintendent of Police. He, in fact, had a habit of doing this. He said it in such a straight-faced way that everyone believed him. He had a great sense of authority. So the cop apologized. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir, and moved away, and they were allowed to stay. But those are just lovely stories that I'm so glad I've been able to capture and preserve. There are many, many more in the book, but I just wanted to mention these two.
Well, Ajita, if I may say so, I get the impression that you're downplaying your own role um, in this book because regardless of how much of yourself and your biography you've put into it, I get the impression that at the very least, from a technical standpoint, it could be described as an edited work with lots of citations, and you're the editor. But I'm sure that there's a bit more autobiographical information as well.
Well, I tried to keep that to the minimum, Rajat. I did tell the story. Well, my favorite story is how I came to Sri Lanka with one suitcase in the summer of '82, and I stayed for 20 years. So I do go a little bit into that story,
Okay.
and yeah, just a little bit about if I had interaction with a particular division or unit or person who was being mentioned, then yes, I bring in my own voice and I recall my own. But I would say on the whole, my purpose was to record the voice of the pioneers, and I hope I succeeded in doing that.
Um, as the internet output now dominates screen time, how may Sri Lankan TV be improved?
Excuse me. Well, it's a living, growing, evolving medium, right? So there's always room for improvement. I think today, just because we have X number of channels, doesn't necessarily mean that we have quality. You know, you can have so many channels, and yet, and people do say this. You're flicking from one channel to the other. There's nothing decent to watch. So, and there's heavy competition now, you know. But I mean, today, unlike in our day, there's limitless possibilities now with technology. So there is no excuse for substandard poor work. You know, you have chroma key or the green screen, you have instant translation, captions, all that AI offers. So, okay, yes, use technology, but use it well. Teledramas, as we just discussed, I mean, you cannot even compare them with Western productions, right? There's a huge gap. My main concern is the pace. It's so slow. The camera lingers on the face. The acting is one-dimensional. There's no, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And I don't know if that's just part of the singular culture. I don't even want to go there because I
Well,
don't
yeah,
think I know it.
without getting too negative, I think you have
Yeah,
also pointed out the limitations, especially in the
right.
news output of reducing the jump cuts when interviewing
Oh,
people.
yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why I think we need more focus on production, editing, audio presentation, and we need to learn from the best. And we can do it now. You simply go online, you type in whatever you want, and you can learn about it, right? It's not. I mean, we had huge training and impressive training programs in the beginning. Our people went to Malaysia, to Germany, to Japan, and that's how we became as good as we were back then. I don't know what's going on today, but you know, you have to the training and the striving for excellence has to be there right throughout. People are complacent today. I think today people just want instant fame, overnight success, and the internet gives them that. You know, so there's a lack of depth and professionalism, I feel, and I don't know how young people are approaching the career today. But I think we were much more thorough, and we invested ourselves in it, and there was discipline, and I do worry in a way about the new generation.
Well, Ajita, I think that many Sri Lankans are probably, or with hindsight, we can all be grateful to your book, and we might be the poorer that the birth of the radio in Sri Lanka has probably never been covered in as much detail as you have covered television. Um, so we're talking about a century of media output in Sri Lanka since the 1920s, and then going on to the 1980s. And so, any other thoughts about what your book represents in the context of Sri Lankan culture? Because so much cultural output, uh, I mean, based on my simple knowledge,
Yeah.
seems to have disintegrated, especially like the movie industry, the theater
Mhm.
industry. I think that we have to end on a note of hope that maybe there's room for those mediums to improve in the future?
Right. First of all, Rajat, I didn't dwell too much on radio because that wasn't the focus of this book.
Oh,
And I
of course,
do
I
believe,
understand. I was
yes,
mentioning a
I do
lacuna.
believe many more books have been written on radio, obviously because it's older than on TV. Yeah. So my intention was to document, and the first 20 years, mind you, because, and you know why I chose the first 20 years, even though we're 43 now, is because I was there, right? So I can speak to whatever I talk about from personal experience. I would not venture to talk about today too much because I'm not involved anymore. And my observations are purely as a listener or as a viewer. But I was fully immersed both at Rupavahini and then in the private sector too. I was a freelancer. So that's why I chose the first 20 years. And yes, I mean, I maybe as the older I get, the more I realize how important history is, how important it is to document and archive our history and our experiences. And like I say, the fact that so many people passed away during this really had quite an effect on me, because it made me realize that if we don't document people's experiences and people's stories and history, there's no going back. It's lost forever. And I don't want us to lose so much of our, as you said, our culture, our media culture. And it's still fairly young. I really want to think that I've helped in some small way preserve even a little bit. And like I say, that's why the book being the U.S. Library of Congress requesting a copy of the book means so much to me, because I think it's a sign that it has some value. And my only, I mean, I'm not making. In fact, I'm in debt because I put in so much of my own money. I'm not making a cent of this book, and I have to. Unfortunately, it's expensive because publishing and printing today is expensive. So my greatest, I feel sad that not many people may be able to afford this book. Those, let's say the retirees from Rupavahini who would love to read it because it's expensive. But the only thing I get out of this whole venture, which has now taken up a few years of my life, is the feedback that I get. And mind you, I'm not looking for praise or a pat on the back, anything. And in fact, I've had some negative feedback, which I've addressed as best as I can. The only thing I get out of it is the feedback from people, I mean, saying thank you, yes, but acknowledging, the role the book has played in maintaining some of this history. And my greatest joy is that.
Well, Ajita, I think that you have done a magnificent job in collating the voices of many, many people who are no longer around. So you have provided them with a voice as well as your own editorial voice, presumably. And we're highlighting your book in the hope that maybe as an archive and other people can hopefully find out much more information in your book that is now available in Sri Lanka. Any final thoughts before we stop?
No, Rajat, gosh, I'm sure we've gone way over the allocated time. I'm just because I know you come across so many books and you review so many books. I'm just very, very grateful and thankful to you for deciding to look at this book. And thank you so much. I mean, it means a lot to me. I haven't in any way promoted or pushed the book. Last year was a very bad year for me in many ways. So I kind of it was published in May of 2024. But that was it. I didn't get involved. I mean, there was no press releases, no news items. I didn't sell it or promote it in any way. So a year later, coming on now, people are still discovering the fact that it's out there. But that's okay, it's there. And if I need to reprint, I will. But I just hope, I hope people find something of themselves in it, especially the pioneers.
Well, I think it's a good time to mention as well that this is not your only book. You have published a number of other books, and hopefully there will also be opportunities for people to find out about some of your other books, not just about your father, but about so many other things. And hopefully there might be some future books that you might come out with. We never know.
We never know. I'm learning late in life, yes, never say never, because it's so exhausting. Each time you're done with one, you say to yourself, never again. But my brother, for instance, keeps saying, oh, when's your next one? You've got to do one about your life. I don't know if my life is of that interest, but that great interest. But yeah, I won't ever say no again, because I know things can change. So let's see
About
what
how
the
many
future
other
brings.
books have you written, if I can
No,
ask? You know.
no, actually, Rajat, no, I have to correct you on that. The book on my father, I mean, I write articles. I mean, I'm a writer.
Okay, yes.
But no, my father's book was my first venture. And even after that, I thought never again. But no, this one happened. I probably need a gap of about 5 years in between each to recover So let's see
Right.
what happens in the future.
So it's been lovely having your voice, and thank you for your time. Goodbye for now.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.